Assalamu alaikum students, and welcome back to class. This is your ENG503, and in prose 2 we are doing Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Just to recap what we've been doing so far, Jonathan Swift is one of the greatest satirists of English literature, and that means that he has written works, or he has created works which look upon the society of the time and point out the faults, the shortcomings, with a view to improving the situation. So people who write satiric prose or satiric poetry are actually doing a great favor to society, because they point out what is wrong with society, and their aim in doing so is to improve the current situation. And that is more or less what Jonathan Swift tried to do in Gulliver's Travels. Now, I told you before that Gulliver's Travels is not the only book that Swift wrote. He wrote essays also, he wrote other works. One of his most notable works is A Tale of a Tub. There's another piece of writing that he's very famous for, and that is A Modest Proposal. We went through all this in the preliminary lectures, but I just want you to remember what it is that we have studied so far about Jonathan Swift. And in the last lecture I told you that Gulliver is trying to relate what happened to him when he visited the land of the Lilliputians, or the country that was known as Lilliput. And if you remember, this is the land of the small people, and because the population of the place, Lilliput, is very short-heighted, short to the extent that you won't find any man or woman who is more than 6 inches high. The majority of them are 4 inches and 5 inches. So if you substitute their inches to our feet, then there are no creatures higher than 6 feet. So in a land of the Lilliputians comes Gulliver, who is shipwrecked after a big storm at sea. And you'll also remember that Gulliver is basically a doctor. He studied medicine with Mr. James Bates, and when he found out that he was not getting any patients in England, he decided to serve on a ship so that he would make a little money and be able to support his wife and family. So he took up a job as doctor in the ship, and just when he had started to feel that he would like to go back home and rest, a storm came up. The captain steered the ship towards a rock, but because the wind was very strong, it blew the ship onto the rock until the ship just split into two, and most or perhaps every one of the people on board, that is the crew, drowned. And Gulliver is the only one who survives. And after swimming for a long time, he finds himself on this land, and he goes off to sleep, and when he wakes up, he finds that he is surrounded by little men. And by little men he means men whose heights are not beyond 6 inches. So this would be the size of the majority of men. As days pass, Gulliver becomes familiar with the people become familiar with him, and then he is presented before the emperor, because the emperor wants to see him. So we had left off at the place where the emperor commands that he be given food, and he is assigned as a lodging or as a house, he is assigned a place that was a temple. And Gulliver makes particular notice of the fact that this temple has a main gate that is only 4 feet high. Now, if you have a doorway that is 4 feet high and your height is about 6 feet, it's very difficult to pass through. So Gulliver has to bend double in order to enter. But the emperor is very keen to make him comfortable, so he has a bed ordered for him, and he orders the villages in that area to provide food and drink for Gulliver. Okay, so now that you have the background again, let's see what we have in this lecture of today. And I told you in the last couple of lectures that we are going to be picking up speed. So you will see that in the lecture that I have prepared for today, you will be going much faster through the slides, because we have a lot of description now. We have a lot of descriptive detail which I want you to note, but which I don't have to explain, or I don't even have to read through, because I know that you people can read very well, and that is why you enrolled yourself in this program. So let's see what Gulliver is up to today. So we start chapter 3 today, and as an introduction to chapter 3, Swift says the author diverts the emperor and his nobility of both sexes in a very uncommon manner. The diversions of the court of Lilliput described, the author has his liberty granted him upon certain conditions. Now this is the gist of the entire chapter, and when we go through the chapter, you'll realize how Swift expands upon different ideas. So he says that the author, that is Gulliver, remember Gulliver is supposed to be writing this, he's writing in the first person, so the author diverts the emperor, that is, he brings up new ideas of how he can keep the emperor entertained and happy, because in order to achieve his basic aim, that is liberty, freedom, Gulliver has to make sure that the emperor is in a good mood, because if the emperor is in a bad mood, he will not grant him his liberty. So what Gulliver does is that he comes up with different ideas in order to amuse the emperor, his queen, the empress, and the rest of the court, because the emperor depends to a large extent on what his courtiers think of other things. And throughout this you will see that there is a thread of sarcasm running through the entire chapter and entire book, and that is because Jonathan Swift is pointing out what is happening in the court, and this court that he talks about is in Lilliput, but you can see very clearly that he is talking about the court of Queen Anne, the court of England. So whatever he says about the emperor, the empress, and the courtiers, you can just change the names and put them in their proper place, and that is the court of England. Okay, so Gulliver says, my gentleness and good behavior had gained so far on the emperor and his court, and indeed upon the army and people in general, that I began to conceive hopes of getting my liberty in a short time. So because he had made a very good impression, remember those 6 people who were shooting arrows at him, and one of them nearly wounded him in the eye. The captain of the guard had presented all 6 of them to Gulliver to punish as he pleased. And what Gulliver did was he put all of them in his pocket, so that they were really scared, because for them the pocket was a deep hole. So it's like being put in the dark hole in the ground, and then he took them out one by one with his penknife. He cut their strings or the ropes that bound them and then put them on the ground to set them free. And that created a very good impression on the king and the queen. So Gulliver is doing all this because he wants them to be in a good mood when he makes an application to be set free. So the natives came by degree to be less apprehensive of any danger from me. I would sometimes lie down and let 5 or 6 of them dance on my hand, and at last the boys and girls would venture to come and play at hide and seek in my hair. So the natives got used to Gulliver, Gulliver got used to the natives, and he started to learn their language. So the good thing was that both parties became familiar with each other, and the fact that they were jumping over his hand, jumping over his boot also later on, as he mentions, and playing hide and seek in his hair, is evidence that the population was starting to feel very comfortable in Gulliver's presence, and he was no longer a threat to them. So one day the emperor wanted to entertain Gulliver, because Gulliver is doing so much for the emperor. So the emperor thinks that he would like to impress Gulliver with what his court can do. And now he's going to give you description of the kind of entertainment that emperors make. And when I say that he's being very sarcastic or he's using satire, you have to note the different places in which Swift sort of hits out at the nobility in general and royalty in particular. So this is the kind of entertainment that the emperor has for Gulliver. So he says that he provides, he sort of calls rope dancers. The rope, of course, is just like a piece of string for Gulliver. But because the Lilliputians are very small, therefore for them a rope that is extended 2 feet from the ground is very, very high up, because that would be at least 4 times their total height. So for a man who is about 6 inches of height, 2 feet would be like 24 feet for a man who is 6 feet tall. So a rope that is suspended 24 feet in the air is what is known as a tightrope. And tightrope walking, you know, is very, very dangerous. You might have seen this, you know, in the circuses. They have this rope stretched from one corner of the circus tent to the other, and there are men and women who walk on it or who will ride on a bicycle and do different tricks. But in a circus, you have to remember, there's always a net below the tightrope. Here, you don't see that. Here there's just that rope, and what Gulliver says, and this is very interesting, what Gulliver says is that this is not the nobility who do it. There are very specific rules for people who participate on this, and this is a very direct hit at the court of England when he says that they are trained from youth. If you go back to the previous slide, he says they are trained in this art from their youth and are not always of noble birth or liberal education. So these are people, he says, when a great office is vacant either by death or disgrace, which often happens, 5 or 6 of those candidates petition the emperor to entertain his majesty and the court with a dance on the rope. So now there are a number of things that he is saying in this slide. One, that whenever a position becomes vacant, there are people who are willing to apply for it. Two, this position becomes vacant sometimes by death, but more often by disgrace. Now this is a very direct hit at the Court of England and the fact that it is not merit that is kept in mind, but the likes and dislikes of the emperor. So whoever pleases royalty gets a good post, and whoever displeases royalty is sent home in disgrace. Now when somebody is sent home in disgrace, that position becomes vacant, and there are always people who are willing to compete for that position. The only problem is with the kind of competition that is held. And here Swift is being very, very sarcastic when he says that the merit for any position is just the rope dance. There is no other merit. There is no test for a position. There is no interview. There is no attempt to see if a person is has the required academic qualifications. Now, if you were to turn this around and bring it to our own situation, you would see that that is very true. Here also we have a number of appointments for which it is not important to have the required academic qualification or professional experience. All you need is someone's recommendation. So the recommendation that Swift brings up is that of a rope dance. And he says, whoever jumps the highest on the rope, and remember this is a tightrope 24 feet up in the air without falling, succeeds in the office. So this appointment, this position is given to the person who manages to jump the highest on the rope, which of course is not really the proper criterion for selection, because rope dancing is something that would not really qualify a man to hold a position at court. For example, that of the treasurer or that of the commander of the guards or anything. You know, even if you are going to be employed as a chef or a cook, you need the required qualification. Rope dancing is not going to help you cook great meals for the emperor, but that is the criterion that the Lilliputian emperor has for selection to the highest offices in the land. So very often the chief ministers themselves are commanded to show their skill. So it's not just people who are applying for a fresh post, but there are times when the king says, all right, you also get up and show them how high you can jump. Now, when you do this to men who are, let's say, advanced in age or who have a lot of weight, it would be very difficult to do. And Gulliver says that out of these, the treasurer, that is Flimnap, is allowed to dance on the rope at least an inch higher than any other lord in the whole empire. Now this is a big honor that is done. It's a big, let's say, favor that is done to Flimnap, the treasurer. And remember, an inch for the Lilliputians would be a foot for you and I. So if somebody is let's say dancing on a tightrope that is 24 feet above the ground, Flimnap is allowed to do it at 25 feet. So an inch higher would be a foot higher for you and I. And that is a kind of honor. I would say that that is putting him at greater risk, wouldn't you? But you see, that is the standard that he has, that is the criterion that the emperor has made for selection to all such posts. So when he is giving greater detail, he says, I have seen Flimnap do the somerset several times together upon a trencher fixed on a rope which is no thicker than a common pack thread in England. Now, a somerset is Swift's word for a somersault. And you know what a somersault is called in Urdu? Can any of you remember? You know what a kalabazi is? That's a somersault. So when he talks about a somerset, he's talking about a somersault. And it is only people who change their minds who are said to do somersaults. So if one day they say one thing, the next day they will say completely different. Their statement will change. And again, Swift is talking about the way that people at court change their minds, change their opinions, and therefore their statements. And they make these changes because they basically want to please the emperor. So they'll do anything, they'll say anything to make the emperor and the court happy. Because if they displease him, then they are removed from office and sent home in disgrace. So he gives you examples of how different people try to please the emperor. He's given you the example of Flimnap. He gives another example of Reldrisal, and you'll see how difficult these names are, because most of these names have been made up by Swift. These are not names that existed in the English language before Swift came in. You have no mention of Lilliput before Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels. You have no mention of the word Huinam. You have no mention of the word Yahoo. And you know, Yahoo is a word that has become very much a part of our vocabulary. But the origin is Jonathan Swift. And in the same way, you don't have any mention of an island called Laputa. These are names that Swift came up with, just as he comes up with the names of the different people who inhabit these lands. So Flimnap is one, and Reldrisal is another, and he is Principal Secretary for Private Affairs. And he is also very, very skilled at doing somersaults, or somerset, as Swift calls them. Now, you have to remember that these are two very important men in court, the treasurer and the principal secretary for private affairs. And if these two people are adept at somersaults, it means that they are in the king's good graces, they are in the king's good opinion, because whatever the king, whatever the emperor wants, they do it. They have absolutely no opinion of their own. Whatever the emperor wants, they do, and that is why they are thought to be very good at somersets, because they want to keep the emperor happy. All right. So these diversions, Swift says, are often attended with fatal accidents. Well, when you're jumping on the rope, when you are dancing on a tightrope, or you are doing somersets on a tightrope, somebody sometime is going to fall. And when you fall from such a big height, there are liable to be accidents, and very, very bad accidents. And Gulliver says, I myself have seen 2 or 3 candidates break a limb. That's the least possible thing that can happen to you. You break a leg, you break an arm, you could break your back falling, you know, and that's something that that is very, very real. But the candidates are not afraid. They will do anything to make the emperor happy. For by contending to excel themselves and their fellows, they strain so far that there's hardly one of them who has not received a fall, and some of them 2 or 3. So these ministers also have to sort of keep in training by doing somersets, by doing rope dancing, because every now and then the king will say, all right, so and so, you get up and you show these young men how a somerset is done. Now you can't say no to an emperor like that. You just cannot say no. So if you do get up, and you do get up on the tightrope, you're going to fall. And that is what happens to these ministers. And Gulliver says, because Gulliver is narrating everything, Gulliver says, I've seen 2 or 3 people break their arms and legs because they cannot keep their balance, they're out of training, and therefore they fall down. And he says, Flimnap once had such a bad accident that if he had not fallen on a cushion, it would have meant that he would have broken his neck. He would have died because he was doing these somersets and this rope dancing. But this was before the arrival of Gulliver. It's a story that is told to him. And then he comes up with another diversion, and he says this is something that is for a restricted audience, and that is the emperor and the empress and first minister. So it's an activity that is carried out in a very, very sort of closed group. The public is not allowed to see this. So let's see what activity the public is not allowed to see, and only the emperor, the empress, and the first minister are allowed. When he describes this, Gulliver says that the emperor lays 3 silken threads, and these are blue, red, and green. And these threads are prizes for this activity. Now these threads you can compare to anything. They can be money, they can be the medals that you are given out, the gold, the silver, and the bronze. It can also be any other award that is given out. It can also be positions that are offered. The topmost, the one in the second, and then the lower. So 3 positions you have for this activity. And whoever gets this thread is a great favorite with the emperor. And this activity, Gulliver says, involves a lot of dexterity. Now what the emperor does is, and this is really funny, you know, what the emperor does is he takes up a stick and he holds it parallel to the horizon. Okay, so he holds it out like this, and those who are taking part in this activity, they come close to the stick, and if the stick is higher than their height, they will go under it. If the emperor brings it lower, then they have to jump over it. So between the jumping and the creeping, the emperor and the empress, and the first minister are really entertained. Now this is something that is done in a very small audience. It's something for which the public is not allowed. And for Gulliver, it is a very strange and very amusing activity, because he has not seen this kind of activity before. And he says that depending on whether the emperor raises the stick or he lowers it, the participants either jump over the stick or they creep under it. Sometimes the emperor will bring it so low that it is difficult for the people to pass under it. And whatever hint he gives, the candidates have to act according to that, whether they want to leap or they want to creep. So he says that these ribbons or these threads are given to the participants, and you will see, if you visit the Lilliputian court, you will see people who wear these threads as a kind of favor that has been given to them, and they are very proud to display it. But the thing is, Swift says that there are few great persons about this court who are not adorned with one of these girdles. So at one time or another, everyone in the court has taken part in this activity and has one of these threads or ribbons or girdles, because what they do is they tie it round their waist. Now, he comes to another point, and that is, just to remind you of what this is referring to, Gulliver had earlier talked about the emperor giving orders for the army's horses to exercise close to where Gulliver is. And this was done so that they would not be afraid, and there would be no repetition of that earlier incident when the emperor rides up close to the person of Gulliver, and the horse sort of rears back and the emperor nearly falls. So after that, the emperor gives orders that all the horses are to be exercised in and around Gulliver, so that they lose their fear. So that is what is being referred to when he says the horses of the army and those of the royal stables, having been daily led before me, were no longer shy, but would come up to my very feet without starting. So by now they have become, not just the human beings, but even the horses have become very familiar, and they can come up very close to Gulliver without feeling afraid. So he gives you a little detail of how close the horses would come to his person without feeling afraid. And he says that one of the huntsmen even jumped right over my shoe. Now that's a big thing. You know, it's something that requires a lot of practice. And he says that this huntsman was so brave that he, together with his horse, he jumped right over my shoe, not just my foot, but my shoe. So Gulliver thinks very highly of this huntsman. And then he goes on to explain how he diverted the emperor. So far what he has told is how the emperor tries to amuse Gulliver. Now you have to see what ideas Gulliver comes up with in order to entertain and amuse the emperor. And what he does is he makes a sort of stage with the help of pieces of wood he takes out his handkerchief. Remember, Gulliver is carrying a huge handkerchief. Now that's a huge handkerchief for the Lilliputians, not for Gulliver. For Gulliver, it's something that he uses. So what he does is he makes a kind of, if you have seen this, this ring, as they call it, where the boxers and the wrestlers have their contests. He makes a kind of ring, and what he does is he makes this ring at a height from the ground. He gives directions, and the emperor assigns men who bring the materials to him, and Gulliver fixes these sticks in such a way that the tiny stage that is made is 2 feet from the ground. Now 2 feet for the Lilliputians would be a height, like for us, it would be something like 6 4s are 24. It would be 24 feet high. So imagine having a stage that is 24 feet high, and then what he does is he picks up the horses and he puts them on that stage that he has made. That's his handkerchief that is stretched tight across these sticks. It's so tight that it's as tight as the side of a drum, so that there's no way that the horses will fall. But what happens is that while they are exercising and what he calls performing mock skirmishes, they discharge blunt arrows. So this is like one of those exercises that our army and navy and air force do, where they have this fictitious enemy and they fight against that, just so that they can sort of improve their skills. So these exercises are conducted in times of peace, not in times of war. And Gulliver is very impressed by the sort of by the discipline that the king's army shows, by the way that they can conduct their exercises in front of him. He is really impressed. But what happened was that this was sort of repeated for a number of days, and the king liked this thing. But then what happened is that one of the horses sort of stuck the ring or the handkerchief with such force that a small hole appeared there, and that meant that the hoof of the horse, it stuck in the hole, and that resulted in the rider and the horse being overthrown, and they would both have been killed, but Gulliver acted very fast and he just caught them in his hand, and after that time he covered the hole with his hand, so that the riders had to go over his hand, but there was no danger of their getting stuck there. So once this had happened, Gulliver discontinued this activity, but you will see that it kept the emperor entertained. The emperor was very happy. You know, this was something that was really really strange, and at the same time it was something that gave his army practice. This was something new that Gulliver came up with, and this kind of a situation the emperor's army had not had experience of, but whatever they did have experience of, they managed to show their discipline and impress Gulliver. And all this, it's leading to the point where Gulliver is set at liberty. Remember, in the last lecture we discussed the fact that Gulliver had written an application to the emperor to be set free. And when he first started learning the language, he learned the words for set me free, set me at liberty. So when the king finds that he does not pose a danger or a threat to the empire, he sets him free with certain preconditions. And Gulliver explained before the preconditions to which he had signed. So he had agreed to all that, but he had not been set free. So he says, 2 or 3 days before I was set at liberty, as I was entertaining the court with this kind of feat, that is, tying his handkerchief, making a stage out of it, and making the troops practice their exercises, their skirmishes on it, he says, some of his subjects riding near the place where I was first taken up said that they had discovered a great black substance lying on the ground, very oddly shaped. So this oddly shaped object, what could it possibly be? I'll give you a guess. Come on. What do you think it can be? It's at the same place where they found Gulliver. Come on, any guesses? No? All right, the next slide will tell us what that object is. Remember, they're surprised when they see Gulliver and they explore his pockets and they see his watch chain and they see the pistols. These are things that they have not seen before, and so they find everything very strange and very exciting. So what is it that they have discovered now? It's oddly shaped, they say, extending its edges around as wide as His Majesty's bedchamber, rising up in the middle as high as a man. It was not a living creature, remember that, because it lay on the grass without motion. It's not like Gulliver. Gulliver gets up, Gulliver starts to move, but not this object. Some of them had walked around it several times, but they could not see the top of the object. So what they did was they climbed on each other's shoulders in order to see what was at the top. They say the top is flat and even, and when some of them climbed up onto it and stamped on it, they found that it was hollow. It wasn't a solid object. So they thought that it might be something belonging to the Man Mountain. And very true. What it is? Gulliver knows what it is. Do you know what it is? No? Okay. Now, he says, before I came to the place where I went to sleep, my hat, which I had fastened with a string to my head while I was rowing, and had stuck on all the time I was swimming, fell off after I came to land. So, it's a hat that the Lilliputians have seen. It's a hat, but it's so big for them, and because they've not seen a hat before, So they are very excited and very curious as to what it can be. So they climb onto it, they try to strike it with their hand, and they discover that it is hollow. So when they describe it to Gulliver, he remembers that he lost his hat after he had arrived in Lilliput, because he was so tired out that he just lay down on the grass and went off to sleep. And when he woke up, he found out that he was tied down to the ground and no thought of a hat entered his head. So it's his hat that they find. And Gulliver says, I entreated His Imperial Majesty to give orders it might be brought to me as soon as possible. So as soon as Gulliver is reminded of his hat, he wants to have his hat. Remember, he had had it when he was rowing. He had kept it on, tied with a string when he was swimming, and although he nearly drowned, he still kept his hat. So his hat is very precious to Gulliver, and he says that I begged His Majesty to have this hat brought to me as soon as possible. And the emperor gave orders, but by the time the hat arrived, it wasn't in a very good condition, because in order to carry the hat, they had bored 2 holes in the brim. And obviously, Gulliver could not wear a hat that had 2 holes in the very brim, because the Lilliputians had needed to fasten hooks in order to drag it. And then what they did was, they dragged it behind horses. So it's a miracle that the hat got to Gulliver. It was a little spoilt. It had gone sort of a little dirty because it was dragged for 1 mile. So now you know that the distance from where Gulliver had been found was 1 mile. 2 days after this adventure, the emperor, having ordered that part of his army to be in readiness, took a fancy of diverting himself in a very singular manner. He desired I would stand like a colossus with my legs as far asunder as I conveniently could. So you see, what he's asked to do is to stand with his legs as far apart as it was possible for him to. And then what do? He then commanded his general, who was an old experienced leader and a great patron of mine, to draw up the troops in close order and march them under me. A rather funny situation. Here you have Gulliver standing with his legs apart and the entire army marching under him. Now, by that time, he says that a few of them would look up and they would get a close look at his clothes. So these are 3,000 foot soldier and 1,000 from the cavalry. 1,000 horse means 1,000 riders. So 4,000 of the Lilliputian army passing under Gulliver. This is sort of a new idea that the emperor has come up with, and Swift is very, very sarcastic, because this is the standard that the Lilliputians have of the kind of training that the army should receive. Having this man mountain standing up and the army passing under him. What kind of an exercise is that? Is that going to help them in defending their country against its enemies? No, but it's something that keeps the army entertained, and that's the kind of activity that the emperor thinks is going to be good for the army. So very, very strong criticism of the likes and dislikes of emperors and kings. And while they are passing under Gulliver, some of them find it very amusing to look at Gulliver's clothes. But Gulliver says His Majesty had given orders upon pain of death that no one is to laugh, that they must maintain the strictest decency with regard to my person. So it's a very funny situation. You know, you have 4,000 army men passing under a human being. And Gulliver says that although the emperor had given very strict orders, still some of them saw Gulliver's clothes, which were torn in certain places, and they couldn't help laughing, even though the emperor had said that if anyone laughs, I'm going to kill that person. Still, you find out that there are people who cannot prevent themselves from laughing at how worn and how torn Gulliver's clothes are. And then Gulliver makes a switch again, and he says, I had sent so many memorials and petitions for my liberty that His Majesty at length mentioned the matter first in the cabinet and then in a full council, where it was opposed by none except Skirmish Bolgulam. Look at the names that Swift comes up with: Skirmish Bolgulam. A little difficult to pronounce, but if we say it enough times, we will get used to it. So this person somehow or the other does not like Gulliver, and when all his courtiers, when all the council members have approved the petition for liberty, Skirmish Bolgulam is the one who opposes it, and Gulliver calls him his mortal enemy. But because there were so many people in favor of the petition, the emperor granted this petition, and this Skirmish Bolgulam, who is actually the admiral of the realm, that is, he's what you and I would call chief of naval staff. So he's the admiral of the realm, and a person who is well versed in affairs, but of a morose and sour complexion. So he's not the kind of person who would joke around or who would try to make someone happy. His entire aim in life is to make people's lives miserable. So Skirmish Bolgulam is the only one who opposes Gulliver being set at liberty. But of course the emperor, because he's in favor of it, so he is persuaded to give his vote in favor of Gulliver being set at liberty. And again you will notice that there is a sort of undertone of Swift commenting on what goes on in the court. If there is a dissenting voice, the emperor or the king uses his power in order to silence any objection, any difference of opinion. And they make a compromise by telling Skirmish Bolgulam that the document which is going to which shows that Gulliver is going to be set at liberty will be prepared by Skirmish Bolgulam, so that he does not have any objection to not being included in the decisions made by the emperor and his council. So these different articles were drawn up by Skirmish Bolgolam, the admiral of the realm, the chief of naval staff, and he came properly prepared and properly presented. All these articles were read out to Gulliver, and he was made to swear to them, first in the manner of my own country and afterwards in the method prescribed by their laws, and see how their laws, that is Lilliputian laws, how they make you swear on something. Human beings in the civilized part of the world swear by putting their hand, the right hand, on the sacred book, and they swear by all that they hold holy, that whatever they're saying they're going to do. So how do Lilliputians do it? This is to hold the right foot in my left hand and to place the middle finger of my right hand on the crown of my head and my thumb on the tip of my right ear. So with my left hand I'm holding on to the right foot, and you can see this pen, I can demonstrate, is my right foot. Okay, so I'm holding on to my right foot with my left hand, and the middle finger is placed on the head, and my thumb is on my right ear. This is how they swear. A very funny situation, but one man's meat is another man's poison. So the Lilliputians have their own way of swearing to something which is very different for us, for people in the West, etc., etc. So Gulliver goes on and he says that I'm going to read out each of the articles. I'm going to describe the articles which formed a part of the document that set me at liberty. And then he gives the name of the emperor first, and listen to the name. Golbasto Momarem Evlami Gurdilo Shefin Muliali Gu, most mighty emperor of Lilliput. And this emperor is not even 6 inches high. Delight and terror of the universe, whose dominions extend 5,000 blustrugs. It's about 12 miles. So maybe one of the small emirates in the Gulf. 12 miles, that's it. And the document says that his empire stretches to the extremities of the globe. Monarch of all monarchs, taller than the sons of men. Of course, that's not true. He's slightly above average height, but he is very, very, very short compared to Gulliver, whose feet press down to the center and whose head strikes against the sun. You know, this is the way that Bolgolam has drafted this document, because he wants to make his king happy. He doesn't want to offend the king. And at whose nod the princes of the earth shake at their knees. It's all a lot of rubbish. None of this happens, but this is the kind of language that is used. And again, Swift is hinting at the kind of language that is used in court documents and which has nothing to do with reality. Pleasant as the spring, comfortable as the summer, fruitful as autumn, dreadful as winter, His most sublime majesty proposes to the man mountain, lately arrived at our celestial dominions. It's just Lilliput. It's not a heavenly country, but that's how Lilliputians see it. So the following articles form a part of the document. First, the man mountain shall not depart from our dominions without our license under our great seal. So, in other words, he will not go without permission from the emperor. He shall not presume to come into our metropolis without our express order, at which time the inhabitants shall have 2 hours warning to keep within the doors. And that's because he could just, walk over these inhabitants and he wouldn't know what he was doing. So he's not allowed to come into the metropolis without warning and prior permission. The said man mountain shall confine his walks to our principal high roads and not offer to walk or lie down in a meadow or field of corn. If he were to lie down in a meadow, he would flatten the grass. If he lies down in a field of corn, he's going to destroy the corn. So that is not allowed. He must only walk on the high roads. As he walks the high roads, he shall take the utmost care not to trample upon the bodies of any of our loving subjects, their horses, their carriages, and he will not take anyone into his hands without that person's consent. The fifth is, if an express requires extraordinary dispatch, the man mountain shall be obliged to carry in his pocket the messenger and horse a 6 days' journey once in every moon, and return the said messenger back safe to our imperial presence. So he's going to do duty as a postman. If there is something, if there's a letter, for example, that needs to be sent in an emergency, then the carrier of the letter along with his horse will be carried by Gulliver to that place, and there the rider and the horse will be taken out of the pocket, deposited, and then when they want to bring an answer back, Gulliver will also bring them back. This is what the 5th article states. The 6th is that he shall be our ally against our enemies in the island of Blefuscu, and do his utmost to destroy their fleet, which is now preparing to invade us. So now he comes to what he actually wants Gulliver to do, and that is that there is just one kingdom that Lilliputians are afraid of, and that is Blefuscu. And Article 6 says that Gulliver will not only defend them against Blefuscu, but he will also destroy their fleet so that it doesn't harm the Lilliputian fleet. 7th, that the said man mountain shall at his time of leisure be aiding and assisting to our workmen in helping to raise certain great stones towards covering the wall of the principal park and other our royal buildings. So he's also going to act as a laborer, because the king wants certain things done, and it would take a very long time for the Lilliputians to do it, even if they had the manpower or the strength. But the man mountain can do it very easily. He can just pick up a stone, put it in another place, etc., etc. The 8th article is that the said man mountain shall in 2 moons' time deliver in an exact survey of the circumference of our dominions by a computation of his own paces round the coast. So Lilliput is an island. What the emperor wants him to do is to walk around the island and measure his dominion, measure his island. Okay, so these 8 are the main articles, and before we end this document, he says, upon his solemn oath to observe all the above articles, the said man mountain shall have a daily allowance of meat and drink sufficient for the support of 1,724 of our subjects. Now you would say, why 1,724? That is the number they arrive at by careful computation. and this is a compliment to the Lilliputians' ingenuity, to the Lilliputians' good math, because they have observed him, they have seen how much he eats and how much he drinks, and they have arrived at this figure of 1724 to give Gulliver the idea that they are not taking this lightly. It's something that is very, very serious. And so this document is signed on the 12th day of the 91st moon of our reign. So you would say that he's been reigning, or he's been governing a little over 7 years. And you notice that time is counted from the day that the emperor ascends the throne. There is no calendar apart from that. So Gulliver swears to these articles with great cheerfulness and content, although some of them were not so honourable as I could have wished, which proceeded wholly from the malice of Skyresh Bolgolam, the High Admiral, whereupon my chains were immediately unlocked and I was at full liberty. The Emperor himself did me the honour to be by me a tongue twister at the whole ceremony. I made my acknowledgments by prostrating myself at His Majesty's feet. Can you imagine Gulliver lying flat on his face just to do honor to the Emperor? The Emperor is about 6 inches high. Gulliver, even lying down, is still higher than the Emperor, but he wants to show how humble and how grateful he is, and that is why he prostrates himself before the Emperor, and he says that the Emperor added as a kind of last remark that he hoped I shall prove a useful servant and well deserve all the favors he had already conferred upon me or might do for the future. So even at this moment, when he sees Gulliver very close to him, the Emperor still tries to prove that he is mighty and that Gulliver is this tiny subject who has to do whatever the Emperor commands. So Gulliver is physically very strong, and yet the Emperor says that Gulliver is our servant and he must promise to obey us and to help us out in any way that the Emperor commands. So even when Gulliver has liberty, it's a physical liberty. He's not to have those chains anymore. He's not to be confined to the temple anymore, but he does have certain conditions that are set on his freedom, and those he will have to observe. So the reader may please to observe that in the last article of the recovery of my liberty, the Emperor stipulates to allow me a quantity of meat and drink sufficient for the support of 1724 Lilliputians. And Gulliver is very curious as to how they arrived at this number, and he asks a friend at court, and they say that they had taken the height of this body and made some kind of calculations, and they thought that since he exceeded their height by a multiple of 12, so this is the number that they arrive at in order to feed him and keep him healthy. So this, Gulliver says, will give the reader an idea of the ingenuity of that people, as well as the prudent and exact economy of so great a prince. So very, very sarcastic at the economy of the prince, at the way that he has calculated, because this means that they will have to provide food and drink on a regular basis. This is not just once only kind of activity, but this will have to be done on a very regular basis. And if you remember from what I told you in the last lecture, he will have the emperor levies a tax on the surrounding villages and says that every village must provide some of the food that is required to feed the man mountain. We're going to stop here, but before we wind up, let me quickly recap what we have done today. When I started the lecture, this was chapter 3, and the introduction told us that in this chapter the emperor and Gulliver entertain each other, amuse each other by a variety of activities, and Gulliver explains in great detail what these activities are, at the same time making certain sarcastic comments to show that these are not things that should be done in court. There are other things that need to be done, because the person of the king or the queen is above and beyond the persons of ordinary human beings. So they need to be thinking of higher things, instead of which the emperor of Lilliput has these activities designed. He has the activity that he carries out for any office that needs to be filled, and that includes the rope dance, it includes the somerset, and then he has activities like the stick that he holds up, and ministers and candidates have either to walk under the stick or jump over the stick, and then he devises another activity, and that is having Gulliver stand erect with his legs far apart, and he has 4,000 of his army men passing under Gulliver. That's the kind of activity that the emperor designs, but which according to Gulliver and according to Jonathan Swift is not really the kind of activity that the emperor or the empress should be keeping busy with. They need to think of other things. They need to think of ways in which they can make their borders safer. They need to think of ways in which they can improve the standard of living for their subjects or the population of the country. But those are not things that concern the emperor. This chapter also gives you detail of this platform that Gulliver makes, and where he tells the king to hold exercises for his military personnel. So that's the kind of very sort of unimportant and insignificant activities with which the emperor and Gulliver occupy their time, until such time as the emperor actually sets him free. But even when he is set free, there's a whole list of articles to which Gulliver has to consent to, and there's a very funny way in which he has to take an oath that he will abide by whatever is written in this document. And this document is prepared by Skirmishes Bolgolam, the admiral of the fleet, and the person who really doesn't like Gulliver, but who has to still bear him. And the chapter concludes by Gulliver saying that in return for everything that he was expected to do, he would be provided with regular meals, and these meals will be equal to the meals of 1,724 Lilliputians. So this is a very, very fixed figure that Lilliputians have arrived at after calculating the difference in the size of the Lilliputians, the size of Gulliver, and trying to see how many Lilliputians are required to make one Gulliver. So that's how they come up to this figure of 1,724, and that's a very funny figure because it's not in the thousands, it's not even in the hundreds, but it is 1,724. So at this figure, that is 1,724, I take my leave. We'll meet again in the next lecture. Thank you very much, and Allah Hafiz.